Good afternoon, everybody. This is always considered the graveyard shift when you're teaching at a university, when you have to do the first session after lunchtime, because everybody's sort of slowed down and it can be really difficult to get everybody back in the groove of things. So I'm going to try and do my best to make it as easy as possible for you to engage with this session. You should be able to see my screen, hopefully, Intersectionality or Austerity and Youth Crime. So let's get started. Intersectionality, austerity, and youth crime. What I want to do in this session, in this workshop, is basically go through four things. I want to define intersectionality, just so that you have an understanding of what we're talking about. I want to then talk a little bit about intersectionality and austerity, look at the ways in which some people have attempted to engage in an intersectional analysis of austerity. Then we're going to take a little peek at how people have thought about this theologically, just the ways in which intersectionality and theology get played out. Before having a little bit of lunch, after lunch fun, which is then watching one of the films that we made for as part of the on the Breadline research, which intersects austerity, youth crime and theology. It's another form of intersection, and then we're going to come back and think about what was intersectional about the analysis in the film and how it could be broadened and improved, and what the implications then are for people engaged in anti-austerity work, particularly from the location of the church. So those four areas are what we're going to work through in this first introductory session before we go into plenary. So look, intersectionality, this is the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. You're probably familiar with her work. In 1989, she produced a groundbreaking essay called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist policies. Yes, she's a social scientist. They have long titles, not like we theologians who like them short and snappy. It's groundbreaking because in this piece of work, what she does is she contributes, this is her talking about it, she argues that in order to analyze any social phenomenon, any social situation, we have to take into consideration the multiple hats and hats that we wear, the multiple identities that people have, and how these intersect within contexts of power.
I have to practice my elevator version of it, but intersectionality is basically the idea that we experience life, sometimes discrimination, sometimes benefits, based on a number of different identities that we have. The basic term came out of a case where I was looking at Black women who were being discriminated against, not just as Black people, not just as women, but as Black women. So intersectionality was basically a metaphor to say, well, they've got race discrimination that they're facing coming from one direction, they've got gender discrimination coming from another direction, and they're colliding in their lives in ways that we don't really anticipate and understand. So intersectionality is basically meant to help people think about the fact that discrimination can happen on the basis of several different factors at the same time. And we need to have a language and ability to see it in order to address it.
Well, we could equally argue that we need a theology as well as a language and an analytical focus to be able to understand it. So intersectionality basically is an analytical framework for interrogating how personal and social identities intersect to create a simultaneity of privilege and discrimination. Note that it attempts to look at the way in which one can be advantaged and disadvantaged at the same time, not trying to suggest that oppression and discrimination leads to no forms of advantage. An attempt to do engage in a granular analysis to look at how complex our lives are. For example, just by virtue of being an African Caribbean man may lead to particular forms of discrimination, but actually being a university academic may give me certain advantages. So there, within my daily experience, reside the simultaneity of advantage and disadvantage. We live complex lives, and this complexity has to be taken into consideration when we are considering analysing any situation. This is not new. We can go back to the 18th century, Sojourner Truth, the anti-slavery, anti-sexist, anti-patriarchy campaigner, introduced the notion of race and gender in her famous "And I Woman" speech. If we're looking at in terms of Caribbean history, Claudia Jones, famous anti-imperialist, Marxist, anti-racist campaigner who established the West Indian Gazette in the 1950s in Britain, also was the founding member of what became the Notting Hill Carnival, first took place in Stepney Town Hall in 1959, wrote an important essay 1949 called An End to the Neglect of the Problems of Negro Women, again introducing the idea of analysing the predicament of Black women in terms of race, in terms of gender. This gets developed later by African-American scholars like Angela Davis, looking at women, race and class, the 1981 text that attempts to outline how these categories intersect in the lives of women. And as we'll see, it requires, therefore, us as researchers to also consider our own reflexivity and how these intersections frame our own experience. There are core principles that intersectionality promotes. I just want to work through them with you as quickly as I can without getting into too much detail, but just to flag up the direction in which it takes us. Firstly, as I've mentioned before, it says that human lives cannot be explained by taking into account a single category such as gender, race and socioeconomic status. People's lives are multidimensional and complex. Lived realities are shaped by different factors and social dynamics operating together. It's the intersection of these factors. Therefore, when analysing social problems, the importance of any category or structure cannot be predetermined. The categories and their importance must be discovered in the process of investigation. So again, it's searching for these intersections, looking at how they get played out in the lives of people. These intersections are all inside of power relationships, because power dynamics between social locations and processes, racism, class sexism, heterosexism, ableism, ageism, sexism are linked. They can also change over time and be different depending on geographic settings. People can experience privilege and oppression simultaneously, and that's quite important here in terms of looking at the dynamics of intersectionality. Multi-level analyses that link individual experience to broader structures and systems are crucial for revealing how power relations are shaped and experienced, and therefore scholars, researchers, policymakers and activists must consider their own social position, role and power when undertaking intersectional research. Intersectionality, however, is fundamentally oriented towards transformation, building coalitions, because if you are looking at analysing these intersections, you're not just doing analysis for the sake of analysis in order to change the way that things work in the social world, looking to build coalitions that might not necessarily have been evident beforehand, and therefore also working towards social justice. Austerity then also gets, so intersectionality has been used to analyze austerity. A useful example of this is Bassel and Emma Jula's work with minority women on austerity, the study of austerity in the lives of women in Britain and France. I'm not sure why they chose France, but it's quite an interesting set of essays on the French context. The key themes in the book, they explore how participants conceptualized the economic crisis and austerity, what impact they thought the crisis was having on them and on their organization, what impact the crisis was having on minority women's activism, and what impact crisis and austerity was having on the ability to influence policymakers. Again, attempting to look at how being women, classed, poor women in Britain, black and brown women in Britain and in France, how that dynamic then impacted on how they negotiated austerity. So intersectionality being used to think about austerity in one example. But we should know when we talk about theology, this is old hat. Womanist theologians have been talking about the intersection of race, class, gender and theology since the 1980s. Jacqueline Grant, one of the founding matriarchs of womanist theology, introduced what she termed multidimensional analysis back in the 1980s, a publication of a PhD thesis, 1988, One Woman's Christ, Black Woman's Jesus. Just read the last chapter. It's a classic James Cone's PhD, 90% analysis of the predicament, 10% what we're going to do about it. It's Americans like to talk, don't they? They like to act. Last 10% deals with the intersectionality in terms of theology. So while the social scientists are new to this, we're not new to it in terms of theology. More recent developments in terms of intersectionality and theology, Sun Kim and Shaw's book, Intersectional Theology and Introduction, develops intersectionality as a theological lens much more clearly. They say intersectional theology invites us to think about our individual stories as both and, Again, therefore, thinking about the complex lives that we live, rather than seeing ourselves as victims or oppressors. Intersectional thinking demands we recognize the simultaneity of our location as persons with both dominant and subordinate identities that give unique shape to our experiences, both across groups and within groups. So again, working this idea of internal complexity, nature, the fact that this complexity includes issues of power, issues of oppression within all of us, and also then using that to situate ourselves as we analyze these complex interactions. Very important when we're thinking about austerity and poverty, because class, race, ethnicity, age, ableism, all intersect to either give certain people advantage, disadvantage, or elements of advantage and disadvantage at the same time. What makes this deep, specifically theological, is method. They argue the way to then get at an intersectional approach is to use narrative theology. The value of narrative as intersectional theology is that it opens the space for us to see, examine, and value the complexities, intricacies, contradictions, and individuality of each person's experience in a way that more linear and systematic theologies do not. Rather than subordinating distinctions or outliers in favor of majority or dominant group expressions, intersectional theology makes room for the specific, idiosyncratic, the overlooked and marginalized that may be speaking in God's still small voice, using their narrative theology's complex traditional thought and action, but undergirded by the idea that story is where we find theology. Story of the Bible is a collection of stories as well as our individual story. Narrative theologians differ in terms of the nature of story and what kind of stories are more valuable than others, but ultimately still underscore the importance of story as a source of theological ideas. So that's how they suggest we get at understanding our own individual intersectionality and how that positions us as researchers, as activists, scholars, as well as how we then interpret the social world as we encounter it. In terms of theological ideas, as method, so a useful book by Edward Donaldson III on the Black Lives Matter movement, which moves towards an intersectional theology. And we're just going to flag these up because we're going to come back to them later on. He says some of the great concepts for thinking about an intersectional theology are exile rather than exodus. The liberation theologians, we've spoken previous sessions about Gutierrez, Leonardo Boff, Kenneth Leach. The liberation motif is most central. God is a liberator, acts in human history to liberate the oppressed from bondage. Not so in intersectional theology. It makes its starting point the exile. Why? Because it wants to cut loose from pre-existing tropes and ideas about God, and instead makes its starting place the wilderness. It uses as an example of wilderness experience the Hagar narrative in Genesis 16 and 21. And Hagar is important because her whole narrative is intersectional. She's an Egyptian woman, gender, ethnicity, marginalize her, and she's poor. She's trafficked and is enslaved and sexually abused, depending upon one's theology, by Abraham and Sarah. She then moves into the wilderness, and it's in the wilderness experience, according to Dolores Williams in her book, Sisters in the Wilderness, it's in the wilderness that she encounters God on 2 occasions, and she does not flee liberation. She goes back into a hostile environment that God provides for her, what womanist theologians term as survival in life, how God enables liberation to take place through survival techniques and traditions. Womanist theologians argue that's how their liberation takes place, not in the way the men's liberation takes place, and as is underscored in the Exodus narrative. He argues a second concept that is important is Pentecost, which enables us to think about difference and hearing different stories and hearing these stories in an embodied form. He takes seriously pneumatology as embodied experience and projects that out into thinking about Jesus and the Spirit, moving to the New Testament Acts, looking at the story of the Ethiopian eunuch as embodied stories, because the Ethiopian eunuch story has been a focus for queer theology, and how embodiment then again introduces an element of diversity and complexity. Sin, another category, Pentecostals like that one. Anything that's against human flourishing, and then salvation for him is to be saved from oppressive systems and to be able to love. So thinking in those categories for an intersectional theology, not just relying on a method that is fundamentally concerned with narrative. Okay, let's just move on from there. Just to flag up, it's not just the Americans doing this, I should say. If you read Chris Shanahan's essay, The Violence of Poverty, Theology and Activism in an Age of Austerity, also introduces intersectional analysis into interpreting austerity. So I just wanted to flag up that it's not just the Americans doing this. We're also active as well. Moving to the fourth area then, what happens when we put austerity, intersectionality in conversation then with youth services, and in particular the way in which youth services have been decimated by austerity. Research from the YMCA in 2020 tells us that about 70% of youth service funding has been cut over the last decade, decimated the service. Scholars differ on how they think about the relationship between the reduction in funding and criminality. James Tradwell, for example, Stafford University, links austerity to the rise in violent crime, says there's a clear and direct link. If you map over the areas that had least money, the crime index, nice crime index rises. There are all kinds of variables involved in that, which lead others in Brennan of Hull University say, well, actually, there may be some truth in the short-term picture, but the destruction and the dismantling, as one scholar calls it, of youth services has been going on for more than a decade. It's a 30-year problem, and therefore you need to look at the issue not only in terms of the current, but also the past experience of funding and youth services. So where does this then lead us? Well, what I want to do next is show you a film that we made as part of the project to then engage in intersectional analysis, encouraging the context to speak to us in complex intersectional terms about the relationship between austerity, youth services, violence, austerity, and theology, triangulating those three issues to see how our context then, what kind of data would be produced through this triangulation in terms of intersectionality. It's quite interesting because we end up framing it in ways that suggest that intersectional thinking is lacking within how our activist theologians reflect on the social crises brought about through austerity. So I'm going to play this to you now.
In recent years, the level of offences involving a knife or a sharp object has risen. Young people are especially vulnerable to the increase in violence, and agencies and political leaders want to do more to protect them. The churches in England are also actively engaged with the crisis. Church leaders, including the Archbishop of Canterbury to street pastors, have spoken for the need for the violence to end and for the church to be a part of the solution. What we want to know is what kind of interventions are the church doing, and how do they confront the causes of serious youth violence, especially the role of government austerity? What theological ideas motivate these church groups, and what more needs to be done? Craig Pickney is an expert on serious youth violence. We asked him to define knife crime and identify some of the causes.
What is knife crime? If I use the Home Office definition, it's any criminal offence where a knife is used as a weapon. I think it's important to understand that crime is racialised in this country. So when we talk about knife crime, if you look at the projection of what we see on media, it's always that same character of a young black male that's done something in a street context, whether to do with drugs, whether to do with postcode issues and whatnot. And those types of interactions oftentimes gets declared as knife crime. And I think that's really important, that understanding that the society narrates this idea of knife crime to be a black issue, and also as an impact of that, two things happen. One, the community and those that are involved in issues around criminality and knife crime believe and assume that they are the ones that are involved in knife crime, and they're also the victims of knife crime, and the wider society also believe it as such. So when we have the conversation now, black knife crime has become synonymous with the activity, just in the same way that terrorism is now synonymous with Islam.
Craig identified 3 factors that exacerbate knife crime amongst young people.
I don't believe that young people in society feel safe. And if young people don't feel safe, the question is, well, what are young people doing in order to ensure that they're going to be safe? There was a publication that came out from the British Medical Journal, and they asserted that for every young person within the UK, or from London specifically, the likelihood for them to be stabbed is between 3:30 and 5:30. So we project this information out to the community and tell the society that the likelihood for children to be in danger is that time. But what are we doing as a society to ensure that young people are safe in that period? So what I believe, based on my research, is that young people during that time period are thinking, well, I don't want to get caught up in that same type of scenario, so guess what? I'm going to carry a knife. But not thinking about the fact and the idea of me carrying a knife is going to put me in two situations. It's either going to put me in a situation where an individual may stop me, search my pockets, and I may get arrested for that. Or it puts me in a situation where I meet an individual that's got a problem that says, what are you going to do with the knife? And then young people then oftentimes, when I work within the criminal justice system and I meet young men, they say things like, I didn't mean to do it. One of the things that often is asked is, why is there a rise in knife crime? What's different? Because violence is always about. So based on my research, what I'm arguing is that social media is the new variable. The way in which young people are communicating now is at a fast rate. Young people don't call each other no more. They're using Snapchat, they're using YouTube, they're using Twitter, they're using Facebook, they're using all of these different types of social media sites in order to engage in their ideas. On those social media websites, it's also telling a narrative of individuals that are saying that they don't want it to happen to me. So this is what I'm prepared to do. So if you don't want to get caught slipping on the road, you need to arm yourself, you need to look after yourself. Austerity has exacerbated the issue, because if you think of the core agencies that we're engaging with young people, we're talking about the youth service, we're talking about services on the ground that we're working with young people and using youth work as an approach, because youth work works. So now that's been severed, what's now happening is that community organisations or statutory organisations that are in the know-how feel less resourced, and they feel like they can't engage with young people in the ways in which they've been trained and they know how to. So what we find now is that we have this phenomena where young people are just being warehoused. So we're inviting them into buildings, but we're not really giving them anything. So we're trying to keep them off the street for a short period of time, but we can't really engage with their issues.
Fear and social media play important roles, but it seems to me, at this moment, it's austerity that's the driving force. If austerity plays a role, then we need to understand it. We asked Stephanie Denning, a researcher in austerity at Coventry University, to explain austerity and its impact on youth services.
Austerity began in 2009, just as the financial crash and the financial crisis ended. And really, austerity has progressed through the last 10 years. And here we're talking about the most recent period of austerity, recognising that there have been, in the past, other periods of austerity. So key things in the last decade have been things like the 2012-2013 Welfare Reform Act. The introduction of universal credit has been another key reform that took 6 payments, benefit payments, into 1 benefit payment. That food banks have seen a direct increase where universal credit has been introduced in the number of people coming to the food bank. Austerity has massively impacted youth services, particularly through cuts to spending on youth services. So we've seen closures of children's centres, closures of Sure Start centres, the reductions in the amount of spending that those that are still running, that they have to run.
Before we take a look at what the churches are doing, we need a framework to interpret their response. The African-American philosopher Cornel West articulates 2 approaches to social crises in deprived communities. The first approach suggests that individuals take personal responsibility for solving social problems. And the second is a structural response, a change in social policy to confront the problems encountered by individuals. In other words, advocacy. West concludes that the best approach is a mix of the 2. How have church groups in Britain responded to the crisis, especially in light of austerity?
We deal with men, women and families who are involved or at risk of involvement with serious youth violence. So we are connected to them in prison, and we're connected to them also in the community. There's something about not having a job. There's something about not having enough money. Austerity is actually, it brings a squeeze in communities that people are now thinking about alternative ways or their way of getting money and funds to service their lifestyle. We start building a relationship with them. We talk to them about themselves. We have a course in prison that we have, it's called the Damascus Road Program, where we have about 13 sessions where we look at violence, anger, family relationships, and how they would look at desistance. The word desistance here means literally termination of criminality or involvement in violence. I describe my work as an enabler, as a befriender, as someone who comes alongside young men, young women who are broken, marginalized, vilified, all the negative stereotyping, and I go alongside them and I walk with them. There's something called an outcome star, which is a model that we use to say, you meet the person where they are first. Some of them will need their hands held. Now they may tell you, who are you talking to? You're not my dad. But after a period of being consistent with them to say, you know what, I'm not disrespecting you. And you know what, I would really want you to understand my heart to help you. Some of them, however, are still on it and don't want to be helped. And if they don't want to be helped, you can't help them. And the unfortunate thing is, we've had to bury some of them. And that pains my heart. Building relationship, I would say, would be about 40%. You know, the advocacy work that we do, we're advocate for the young people and their families, not just young, as I said to you, we're family orientated. What is important now, what we're championing, is for the public sector to understand the need and necessity to involve communities and community groups in their construct of interventions, because all the young people we are talking about are from communities. They don't come from outside of space, for want of a term. They're from communities and they're known by people.
Our biggest program, if you like, is the SPEAR program, and we work with unemployed 16 to 24-year-olds who've all come from backgrounds that have created barriers to employment, and we help them to overcome those barriers and sustain work. We partner with churches around the UK, and we run a program that lasts for a year altogether, but with a very intensive 6-week period at the beginning, and help them to get their minds set ready for work, thinking about their attitudes around work, what they believe about themselves and about their place in the world, and then helping them to navigate some of the sort of hidden rules of the working world that sometimes no one's shared with them, and yet they're being penalised for. It's been really interesting. We've been running SPEAR for 16 years now, and through that period there have been recessions and there's been austerity, and we've seen all kinds of highs and lows in the economy. Throughout that period, actually, the cohort that we work with has endured. We've definitely seen an increase in the sort of prevalence of serious youth violence over that 15-year period. I know when I started coaching 15 years ago, I don't think we had young people with a criminal record, but it was very unusual to have anyone who'd been stabbed, and certainly not perpetrators of stabbing. That's not uncommon now in our cohort on both sides of that equation. And we've lost a couple of young people to knife crime over the last 15 years, which has been a really tough time for us as an organisation. So I think in terms of advocacy, we've focused our attention on the business.
Okay, just in the interest of time, I'm just going to speed up to the theological responses, because I think these are quite significant when thinking around the subject of intersectionality. So we're just going to get to the end of Ben Lindsay talking about his work with Power the Fight.
And that, you'd think that exists, but not something which is very specific to the critical incidence of knife crime and youth violence and gang crime. Every workshop we've done, you would have parents sitting next to teachers, sitting next to police officers, sitting next to surgeons, sitting next to imams, sitting next to pastors. because we do not believe that this is one part of society's responsibility. It will require a societal response. But we also teach churches how they can speak truth to power individually. People can join the independent advisory groups, people can join their safer neighbourhood teams, people can write to their MPs and their councillors and legitimately ask, well, what is our strategy for serious youth violence in this particular borough?
It's clear that churches engage in a mixture of individual support and policy change, but they're not limited by the dictates of government. If the government can help, it's great, but governments come and go and their policies vary. Instead of relying on government, our church groups ground their vision for change in models from the Bible.
My theology is rooted in the Luke 4 verse 18 narrative, and I'll explain that. When Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me. I'm a Pentecostal, so there's something about my root in the Spirit of God. At the same time, I'm a practical theologian. That means that I cannot just say the Spirit of the Lord is upon me and he's anointed me. Look at the further bit of the text. It says to do something, to engage with poverty, to engage with marginalized people, to engage with people who are in prison.
In Jesus we see not only the command to go and love others as we love ourselves, but also the example of sacrifice. And that's something, I believe that without sacrifice we won't see change. So the example of sacrifice we see from Jesus. He gave everything, gave his life for those around him. And that's very much part of who we are as an organisation, wanting to be an organisation that sacrifices, whether that's our time, whether it's our energy, whether it's where we live, where we choose to live and choose to orientate our lives.
We see that in Isaiah 1, we see that in Micah. There's plenty of scriptures which encourage us to fight on behalf of the immigrant, fight on behalf of the widow, fight on behalf of the alien. You know, we're on the poor. We are to support that.
I did a rather unusual Bible study on Ecclesiastes and Lamentations in deciding whether or not to take this on, and I think I was struck by how often the Bible talks about how good it is for mankind. I'm assuming he meant women, for mankind to work, and how much dignity comes from finding the contribution you've got to make to the society you work in.
We set out to discover what the church was doing in response to serious youth violence. What we found is a mixture of individual empowerment and advocacy for policy change. Rather than being limited by austerity, they have a radical vision for individual and community transformation and are not totally dependent on government policy. While these organisations are austerity proof, the communities they serve are not. And if austerity is here to stay, can the church continue to bear the cost?
Okay, that's the film. It raises if we go back to what Edward Dollison was talking to us about, what refers to in his work, and specifically the importance of thinking about I'm going to go back to it actually. I had a double version of it there. We think about austerity require intersectional thinking theologically, requiring us to think about moving from traditional categories into a new space, seeing interactions of race, class, and gender, hearing difference and diversity, thinking in terms of structures, thinking of salvation in terms of removing of any oppressiveness. And then what we can see is there's actually a tension between an intersectional gaze and what Christians who are working with youth crime, advocacy, and from a church base are thinking in terms of these categories, a kind of a tension, which leads me to think that there's still a battle to be won for this kind of thinking to engage with church practice around issues of austerity. So I'm going to end there just because of the limitations of time. I've gone on far too long and didn't get through all of the material I wanted to. So we'll pause there and just open the floor for any questions that there are.
Thanks very much indeed, Robert. That's excellent, and really challenging, and great to see that film that you made, Swords into Ploughshares, as well. Here's Katie's imaging of that session for us. Oh, here's Nigel. Let me put Nigel's question to you. Things are real bad right now, but I can't help feel it's just the next sad chapter in our symbolic societal violence against young people, which has been going on for years. Is there a comment or a reflection that you can offer to Nigel?
Nigel, I think your analysis is consistent with some of the research on the defunding and dismantling of youth services, which suggests it has been going on for several decades, just in terms of pounds invested. However, what I would contrast that with is a sense of hope and transformation that you find within the 4 specifically interview for that film. All of them are deeply invested in transforming the lives of young people that they encounter. And all of them speak, as you will see if you download and watch them, in quite powerful and I'm trying to think of the word to use here. It's not just powerful, but they're deeply convinced that they're having an impact and making a dent. And I think the third thing that I'd just flag up, which is related to what I talked about before, although these organizations are, range from Anglican through to evangelical Pentecostal, all of them share a critique of the government and a need to look at ways in which the church on the ground can provide hope and transformation, almost independent of who the government is. Not necessarily saying they're not going to engage in government, not take funding, because many of them do, but a recognition that you can rely on God, but you can't rely on government.
Question from Eunice. Thank you, Eunice. In the pandemic, many congregations seem to privilege resourcing adults rather than young people. How can we encourage churches to engage with young people?
I think if I had that magic formula, I would have gone into prosperity doctrine and as a youth church full of young people. And no, I think to be quite serious, Eunice, I think there are churches that do this and it becomes a specialized ministry. And I think a really good case study is Hillsong London, the branch that meets specifically at Tottenham Court Road. Just a quick story. If you went there 20 years ago, the average age would have been under 30. If you return there now, 20 years later, the average age is still under 30. So, what they've been doing over the last several decades is working with and developing young Christians. I don't think they see it as a specialized ministry, but the data suggests that it is. And if we use them as a case study of how to engage, then there are 5 or 6 key things that they're doing. Specializing in modes of worship that engage young people, preaching and teaching that engage young people, a plethora of parachurch ministries that engage young people, and most importantly, a neutral, superfluous gospel that doesn't challenge anybody to do anything too much. And I think there's a great deal of scholarly investigation into the theology of Hillsong and its brand being love. It works for young people in metropolitan areas like London, like New York, where the church flourishes. So there's something happening there in terms of their theology. We'd be critical of it, but it seems to work. So I think that kind of specialized work is a signifier of good practice. And from what I've seen online, that's continued during lockdown and during COVID and throughout austerity as well. So if you're in London, I would suggest, when they start up again, visiting it. I've got to admit, I'll end with this. There is a bit of research on this in visual form, and it's called The Battle for Christianity. We made it for BBC One 2016, and we feature Hillsong London as a case study of how to resist the declining church numbers and how to work with young people. So there's a case study, visual case study, looking at how they actually go about doing it. But just to note, it's the only church I've ever been to where they had the peace and everybody ran away from me because I was so old. So just be aware, it's young and it's cliquey and it will make you feel very old. I think I'm going to have to end on that note, Chris, in order to get.
I understand. You're making me feel really, really old, Robert. But Thank you very much indeed for sharing those thoughts about intersectionality, austerity, and youth crime. Really challenging and really helpful. Great piece of our life on the Breadline jigsaw. Thanks very much indeed, Robert.
Thank you.